Welcome to the webinar on trauma-informed approaches for vulnerable pupils. Welcome Lesley Parkinson and myself, Roger Thompson, from Merseyside Violence Reduction Partnership. And we're here today to talk about an activity that was undertaken over recent months, which we're wishing to share and discuss with yourselves. So we do hope you're going to find today's webinar useful. Welcome to everybody. We're certainly aware that for this live webinar there are a number of colleagues across Merseyside that are viewing this, and we also have others from outside Merseyside. So again, a warm welcome to yourselves, and we hope you find it of interest. There are opportunities for questions to be asked whenever you wish to do that, and we will take those towards the end of this presentation. Just a little bit first about violence reduction partnerships. There are 18 violence reduction units, we call ourselves a partnership, in England and Wales. And pretty much we're here to do what it says on the tin, to reduce serious violence. For ourselves, particularly youth violence in public spaces. The mission of the Merseyside Violence Reduction Partnership is believing that all communities across Merseyside have the right to be free from violence in order to provide the best life chances for all. Ours is a partnership of many organisations. What is particularly unique for Merseyside is that we have representatives from the Department of Work and Pension around the table and Merseyside Fire and Rescue, alongside other colleagues that you'd expect to be there from probation, from early years, from youth justice, and also working with our organisations in the voluntary sector, all coming together to deal with the causes of serious violence using a public health approach. So my role within the Violence Reduction Partnership is the education lead, and from a public health approach, what I'm keen to be able to do is to be promoting educational activities that provide maximum benefit for the largest number of people across Merseyside. Examples of our current universal activities beyond our early years work, as we start to talk about those within statutory schooling. Well, for our primary school cohort, we support our teachers with aerial trust, providing a grassing or grooming resource, which essentially helps children identify and resist grooming associated with gangs and violent crime. Then for our secondary cohort and pupils, then we have our Mentors in Violence Prevention programme, MVP. And that's provided by Merseyside Youth Association. And that's a peer-to-peer leadership programme, addresses serious violence themes, and excitingly, it's about young people supporting other young people to talk about those very issues, using what we class as an active bystander approach. And that's about checking out and challenging issues that need challenging at a low level. And so 1 in 3 secondary schools across Merseyside are now using Mentors in Violence Prevention. And I'm conscious that there's a wide group of people that are on this webinar from Wirral, and for our secondary school colleagues, that's that one area where it's less obvious. So if you have an interest in MVP, then usually using our details at the end of this webinar, then please ask for more details about that. The police's Safer Schools officers also provide presentations for our secondary population on child criminal exploitation and more recently on arson. Afterthought are doing some work at the moment with our further education colleges, and that's in relation to violence against women and girls agenda in relation to peer-on-peer sexual abuse, which is being trialled at the moment. And then finally, School Improvement Liverpool are providing teacher training at primary and secondary level to explore misogyny and sexual harassment, which enables and encourages and gives confidence to teachers when talking about these issues and issues around consent, not just in PSHE, but in all school life. So that's our universal approach. We also are trialling targeted activities, and so that's really supporting those that are most vulnerable and tackling risk factors. And a few quick examples of those would include a solution-focused mentoring programme at primary age children. That's provided for by a national organisation, Action for Children. We have Merseyside Fire and Rescue providing their Beacon service and project, which is a 6-week alternative provision course, education course rather, for 9 to 11-year-olds. We have St Giles Trust providing in one of our local authorities delivery of one-to-one mentoring support for those young people who are most vulnerable and facilitated awareness raising sessions. And then Magistra is providing for our pupil referral unit, Pupils, a trauma-informed restorative life skills project, which is being trialled at the moment. We're not only about funding and considering activities, we also want to provide resources to be supporting schools and organisations. And when you are able to use the link at the end of this webinar, then I hope you'll see and be able to download some of those resources that you may find useful. So an example of those is delivering violence reduction learning in schools. That provides a steer for organisations and schools when presenting and arranging activities in schools. That's a checklist to give a confidence that it's appropriate, trauma-informed, and from a child protection perspective when we're using violence reduction activities in discussion with young people. Guidance when considering permanent exclusion is also there. That highlights the principles, the consequences, and local authority by local authority identifies some local level support. Within the guidance, there's nowhere that we're saying permanent exclusion shouldn't take place. We recognise that it needs to be there, but for it to be used ever so cautiously is the message. And it's our way of trying to support schools in recognising other ways in which they may deal with such issues, because essentially our concern around permanent exclusion and the life chances of a young person once given that label is incredibly problematic. What you need to know about child criminal exploitation is a young person's guide to that very subject matter, short and clear guide with signposting that's available. And then I mentioned our Safer Schools officers, so you'll also see on there facilitators' notes for the packages that we offer to the Edge and Jay's story. And then finally, and I've got there in the end, sorry for that long spiel, we've also got our guidance that we're promoting today, which is trauma-informed approaches for vulnerable pupils. And that's sharing the learning that you're going to be hearing about in this webinar in supporting young people through schools' COVID recovery plans, recognising the individual pastoral support and the need for potential modifications to the curriculum and to the environment. And so it brings in Lesley now as I've described those details. And in talking about this webinar, it stems from conversations that I had with Lesley just over a year ago when we were thinking of what activity might be of use or of interest. It had stemmed for me from reading about Oxford University's reports, the Excluded Lives Research Group. And their report was about school exclusion risks after COVID-19. I know our project isn't about school exclusion necessarily, but I found it quite interesting to see their report. And it described the social and emotional disruption that was caused by the pandemic and how that was likely to have increased or exacerbated student anxiety and other mental health issues. There was also concern about school connectedness for vulnerable students whose standards of attendance were wanting and had been disrupted. And that's been proven as we're definitely not back to the school attendance levels that pre-pandemic. It also, in the report, created a pen portrait of some of those pupils, which I found interesting, just to give an example of a couple. So they described the doubly excluded. So that's the person who possibly was permanently excluded or was on the verge of permanent exclusion, but otherwise was not known to services or didn't hold a statement of special educational needs and the vulnerability that they had. The happier at home pupil. So that was that person who actually was less anxious because of COVID, because they didn't feel pressurised in the way that they had prior to it. Then there was the coming out of left field, which was a very important one for me. And that was those young people who were previously without issues, but now were presenting them as they then come back post-pandemic. And so they were anxious, where they previously hadn't possibly been anxious, were grieving. It was problematic for them. And alongside that, that report picked up on the worried teacher. So the teacher's own mental health and well-being, the support that's required for themselves as well as for this new cohort of people with potential vulnerabilities. So in essence, it really was recognising that those adversely affected by COVID-19 were extremely diverse. And it suggests that we need to think beyond those that originally we'd viewed as vulnerable. And there was recognition, there was a time for schools to reconsider the role of education. So this is a positive. This is something that comes out of it that actually says, and it's not so much something that you can do and I can do, but in essence, it's about Ofsted picking up on these things, that there's a balance there, isn't there, in relation to academic excellence alongside student well-being, which clearly is at the forefront. And teachers wanted more training on social and emotional development, how they can develop those skills as an integral part of subject lessons, as well as learning about trauma. And so that was why we felt that we should put together an activity which supported a group of schools where we would be thinking through, post-COVID, how they could be dealing with that new landscape of vulnerable young people. That's how Lesley very kindly took on that mantle and considered how she might support a group of schools right across Merseyside. So I think it makes sense for me to hand over now to Lesley to describe that project in a little more detail.
Thank you very much, Roger.
Pleasure.
Hi, I'm Lesley from Restorative Thinking, and we work with schools to introduce and embed restorative practice. And we're also working with youth offending services, prison and probation services, children and adult services, and police and crime commissioners. And my colleagues and myself have a common shared purpose through our work with schools. And this is to promote positive relationships. And for these relationships to drive every interaction in school. And to underpin every part of a school's achievement agenda, be that behaviour, attendance, attainment, reducing exclusions, or even something else. So here on screen you'll see the structure of today's webinar, and I invite you to take part by using the chat device. And also please feel free to contact me, and I'm sure Roger would agree that it's okay for you to contact him too after the webinar if there's a theme that you'd like to pick up on. So I would like to invite you to take a moment to reflect, to think about who was the adult in your life when you were a young person that you felt comfortable with. Someone who knew you, believed in you, brought out the best in you, challenged you, and brought out your potential, and made you feel that you had potential over and above and beyond what you thought you could be. And what did that feel like? How did that make you feel? So whilst you're thinking about that, I invite you to write in the chat function who that person was. if you'd like to share this. That'd be helpful for us. And whilst you're doing that, I want to tell you about my big influence when I was a young person at school. It was my PE teacher, Mrs. Highton. She was quite strict, so you always knew where you stood with Mrs. Highton. And she also had a very human side. Praise from Mrs. Highton was always very specific and felt completely genuine and authentic, and it made me feel fantastic. So she's the teacher that I sought out for careers advice, and she was always quick to point out my strengths as she saw them and areas that I could work on. She made me feel that anything was possible. Have we got any feedback, Roger, from people?
Not that I can see,
Okay.
but we're having some problems with the chat in any case.
Okay. I imagine you might be thinking of a particular parent, a friend of a parent, an aunt, an uncle, grandparent, maybe a scout leader. And I think that many of us have had that experience of a positive relationship with an influential adult. And I think we would all agree that relationships really matter for young people. And this leads us into restorative practice, which helps us to develop and maintain positive, healthy relationships in any and every context. So restorative practice gives teachers and school staff the insights, knowledge, understanding and skills to foster positive relationships with pupils by adopting shared language structures, principles and skills to deliberately plan time and space to generate good relationships. And this is done via circle processes, as you can see on the screen, via restorative inquiry, fair process, the quality of listening with intent, and all of this through a trauma-informed lens, a curiosity about a child's backstory, their strengths and needs. So restorative practice provides us with key cognitive and conversational skills in addressing and making sense of what has happened and what is happening.
Lesley, when you were just saying that,
Yeah.
the one had come through from Hannah, who was saying it was her form tutor. She didn't feel like a teacher. She always asked about life outside of school, which is interesting.
Thank you, Hannah. Thanks for sharing that. That's really helpful and useful. So the project that Roger commissioned Restorative Thinking to deliver is devised and managed by Roger and his team. And they recognise the need for schools, as Roger's already explained, to think about recovery plans following pupils' long absences from school. So we couldn't simply expect pupils to come back to school this time last year and to pick up where they left off. That would be unrealistic. And so we wanted to look at the importance of that return to school through a trauma-informed lens. And we took the view that the pandemic itself was and is potentially an experience of trauma by both pupils and staff, and this was our starting point. So my colleagues and I delivered the project through this lens, bringing in restorative practice as a means to explore the quality of relationships, how to create opportunities and safe spaces for everyone to process their experiences of the pandemic, to have conversations that build healthy and stronger connections with each other. And I should perhaps add that a key benefit of restorative practice is its immediacy. So we can begin to use this shared language, shared techniques immediately. So through this project with schools, we were able to revisit and in some cases introduce adverse childhood experiences and trauma, to consider definitions of these and ways of recognising and understanding types of trauma in pupils. And we then placed a focus on introducing and developing restorative practice principles and skills so that schools could be proactive and find time and space to lead conversations, ask the right questions, listen with intent. So with all schools, we looked at isolation practices. So isolation practices include asking a pupil to stand outside the classroom for a period of time, an internal exclusion, a fixed term exclusion. So we wanted schools to consider revising their school policies and practices so that we didn't re-traumatise young people or trigger anxiety or regression in pupils by separating them through isolation. And we also raised awareness with schools of the developmental psychology that underpins human behaviour, how what happens in our brains relates to our behaviour. And this helped us to work with schools to revisit behaviour policies more widely and to explore the difference between collaboration and control. The difference between restorative discipline and punitive measures can be the difference between continuing or ending cycles of trauma. So on screen here you'll see the 10 schools that took part in this project, and I've just indicated above each list of schools how much contact they were able to have with us as part of this project. So our offer with each school was dependent on the strengths and needs of each school and the intended outcomes. And so our project looked different within each school. And so what we put here are the offers, what was on offer between September and December 2020. We started with a literature review, and we turned this into a working document with schools because we wanted schools to have real ownership of it. So we created the bare bones of the literature review, and then we invited schools to send us their recommendations for adding to that list, which they did. And then in early October 2020, we ran a 2-day face-to-face training course. 4 schools attended. We looked at adverse childhood experiences and trauma, and then we looked at how to manage these through restorative principles, skills, conversations. We delivered in-house face-to-face training during that time with 2 schools. We did a lot of Zoom coaching and training, and we had an e-learning course that we'd developed during the summer months, restorative practice in the return to school, and several schools signed up to that. And we were also able to deliver one-to-one and small group supervisions. And then of course in January this year, schools went back into lockdown, and so pupils were again sent home for a prolonged period of time. So we refreshed our offer and we set up a weekly schedule of open shared Zoom sessions for all of the 10 schools, and these took place twice a week, and you can see on the right hand list there, I won't read them out to you, you can read them. These were the themes that we covered, and we repeated these themes so that schools would have an opportunity to join us for at least one of these sessions. The e-learning continued, the supervision, looking at policies, drafting relationships policies, and we had really good contact with many of the schools throughout this period. We started to hear back from schools how they were starting to draw on restorative practice to make changes to the curriculum. One of the most obvious ways of doing that is via circle processes. And we heard a number of schools were introducing these either in form time through a particular academic department. At one school, the English department took this on as their thing, and they wanted to get it right before sharing it with other colleagues throughout school. And then in terms of modifications to the curriculum, we also had teachers now thinking very consciously about ACEs and trauma, about developmental psychology, the relationship between what's happening in the brain and what we see in terms of challenging behaviour, and also restorative inquiry, a series of questions that can be used to explore, to resolve minor conflict, and to have those conversations on a safe emotional level with each other and with pupils. We had modifications to the school environment as one outcome of this project. So Walton High School actually dedicated a room to restorative practice, and they've got a diary to show how the room is used, and I'm pleased to report that that room is still up and running. The key challenges we faced throughout the project were underpinned by the uncertainty caused by the pandemic, which did make it challenging for some of the schools to engage with us more. But I think my key message around that has always been that we at Restorative Thinking, and I think Roger and his colleagues as well, were always very pleasantly surprised how far the schools were willing to engage with us at this very difficult time. And as a former teacher, it took me by surprise quite how much we were asked to deliver coaching, to bring input and to guide the teachers through this tricky time. We were restricted in terms of delivering face-to-face training, but so was everybody else last year. We had hoped to engage face-to-face a little bit more with young people, and we wanted to involve them a little bit more in shaping and delivering the project, and that bit wasn't as possible as we'd hoped. And I think you'll see we had more successes. Schools were very welcoming, very willing to engage. Communication with schools was really good. 8 schools have got a recovery plan in place, which is informed by adverse childhood experiences, trauma, restorative practice. We worked together to find solutions to issues that schools were facing. Really good qualitative feedback. I'll share some of this with you in just a sec. The schools tell us that they really benefited from the project, and several schools have told us that they'd like more. Roger.
Okay. Noted.
No pressure. So this is some of the feedback. I think it speaks for itself. How teachers managed, and NQT in this case, to draw on RP. Bringing trauma into the equation as well. We've got some more of these. Restorative inquiry questions being used on patrol duty, asking what happened rather than why. So we do take that question why out of the equation when we're delivering restorative inquiry. Why provokes a defensive response, and it also says to the person that we're asking that we've already judged them, we've already made our mind up that they're at fault, whereas what happened is asking their version of events, and it's much easier, it's much nicer to answer that question. And then one of the most astounding pieces of feedback came at left of centre from Claire Campbell from Sacred Heart Catholic High School, who told us that there had been a significant drop in the number of permanent exclusions since using the approaches identified in the training. She said there's an answer that we never had before. That was music to our ears, and really significant to us in terms of delivering this project. And then we sent an email out to the schools last week and said, what's going on with RP? We're a year into the project. Where is it still running? Really pleased to see from Hannah, who gave us the feedback recently in this webinar, that they no longer have a behaviour policy. It's now a relationships and restoration policy. That says heaps about how they've shifted their paradigm in terms of thinking about behaviour and relationships, which is fantastic. And I'm sure they're doing that really well. So this brings us to where we are at now. We've got the webinar, which is going to be on the Merseyside Violence Reduction Partnership website, along with the guidance. And we have created with Liverpool Schools and with the Family Strategic Team at LCC 4 e-learning courses. Now these are available to all schools. They are freely available to all 160 schools in Liverpool and at cost to other schools. So if you like what you've seen and heard about restorative practice and trauma-informed approaches, you may be interested in these courses. And that just leaves me with some final reflections. Everything we say and everything we do as a member of staff in school has an impact on young people. It can be negative and it can be positive. And with restorative practice, it makes it really easy for it to be positive and for it to be consistent across the school. Here are our contact details, so you are welcome to get in touch with myself. I'm sure Roger too, if you'd like to know more about this project or the other work that Merseyside VLP are doing. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lesley. As we've said, it's an opportunity for any questions that people might wish to ask, so please use that chat if you've got something to ask Lesley. What I was just going to say is, what do you think, Lesley, would be let's imagine that we have people that are watching this that haven't necessarily started to go down that road of a restorative practice approach. What would be the first things that you'd be putting in place or supporting in a school if you were to take that on board?
It's a good question. It really is different depending on the school. So every time we work with a school, we take a starting point, we have a conversation, usually with the head teacher, the deputy head member of the SLT, and we say, you know, what are your intended outcomes from restorative practice? What are you hoping to achieve? Is this around behaviour? Is it around attendance? Is it around the school ethos? Are we trying to change the relationships that teachers have with pupils? And so once we know that, we then take a stock check and a gap analysis and look at existing strengths and needs within the staff, within the school, and then we can formulate a plan. So there's no sort of blanket approach with restorative practice, but I think the e-learning courses are a really good way in terms of getting information and seeing what it looks like in primary, secondary, special schools. Does that answer your question?
It does. I mean, I think for me it's got to be, if it's being considered, it's not in a silo. It's a whole school approach to something, and so it doesn't necessarily just involve certain members of staff. It's the whole school community, isn't it?
It is, and that there are some research papers coming through, quite a few actually from North America, to show that with a whole school approach, we need the head teacher on board, we need the head teacher to advocate for restorative practice if a whole school approach is going to be successful. And you're right, it works much better as a whole school approach than a teacher or a department taking it on and trying to make that change in a confined way, if you like. That's the best way of describing it.
Yeah, and I don't want to steal or take away from the learning that you provide when you're commissioned by ourselves or by schools to go in. Yeah. But can you just give us a couple of examples of, I don't know, reframing the way that we'd say something to somebody with using a restorative practice?
Sure. I mean, I'll tell you, I'll go through restorative inquiry. It's a questioning structure that is, I've mentioned easier that it's immediate RP. Right. So if we introduce this to teaching staff, a whole staff, and we ask them to start using restorative inquiry, and we give them a little lanyard so they've got the questions in front of them, this is something they can start to do right away. So instead of coming across a couple of pupils who might be arguing with each other or disagreeing, or even start looking like they might be starting to fight with each other, we, rather than say, what are you doing, why are you doing this, we would ask, what's happening, what's happened, what are you thinking, what are you feeling, who's been affected, and what needs to happen to make things right. And one of the key questions for me is that last one. So we ask the pupils to come up with their own solution. And so they then become involved in problem solving, and they learn, they kind of train their brain to think in that way.
Okay. And I know there was some mention of exclusions, and I noticed there in the chat there's an example that we've got of one of our schools where there's a feeling that permanent exclusion has been reduced, if not eradicated, because of this practice.
Yeah. And I spoke with Claire and I said, so, you know, how come this is quite a big outcome in such a short period of time? And she told me that the training that they had in restorative practice had simply helped them to take a step back and not to feel, when they were presented with a child that was possibly going to be excluded, not to feel that they needed to make the decision there and then. And they have now a 24-hour rule. And so they take a breather for 24 hours, and within that time, all of the teachers and staff around the pupil try to think of alternatives to exclusion and consider them seriously, and to try and put a different plan in place rather than just going for the exclusion.
Yeah, and that aligns actually with our guidance that I mentioned before you were describing yours, because certainly in that guidance, what I was key for us to be able to achieve in that was a pause. to think through. So without saying that that wasn't necessarily going to be the action, because it might end up being the action of permanent exclusion.
Yeah.
But that pause and reflection is so important, isn't it?
It is.
To be thinking things through.
Yes.
So.
And I think a lot of the theory that underpins restorative practice is very much around taking a step back when we're confronted with challenging behaviours, taking a step back, thinking through some of the theories that you've learned, and putting this into practice in terms of how you choose to respond to the behaviour. And that makes all the difference.
Yeah, and it's a skill in the sense that when we're saying it in a calmer setting now, it makes sense. It can be a little bit harder when you're under pressure.
It can, but it's like any skill. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And also, in terms of the questions that I talked about, restorative inquiry, there is a right time and a wrong time to ask those questions. And again, this is where developmental psychology comes into the equation again. What's happening in the young person's brain? And once we know that, we know when the right time is to ask a question, or even to bring students together in a circle. You know, now we talk about running brain-aligned circles. So when we call pupils into a circle, how do we know that they're ready to answer a question, that their brain is in the right place, and what can we do at the start of that circle just to check in to make sure that everyone's brain aligned and able to take part in the process.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I feel we've come to the end of this particular webinar, so I hope you've found it of interest. The details of our website will be available at the end of this webinar, and by linking into that, then you'll certainly be able to see on our education page all those different resources, especially the resource that we've been talking about today, the trauma-informed approaches. And this guidance is effectively hot off the press, so it's the first time that it's been released today for you to be able to download. So we hope it's been of use to you. Thanks again, Lesley, for being here today, and thank you for joining us. So I wish you a good afternoon.